It's wonderful to be here at Brantwood, the home of John Ruskin, to continue the celebrations of the University of Cumbria, our 10th anniversary, and to do that by hearing from Richard Little as our new visiting professor of sustainability leadership. And Richard, as some of you will know, has a distinguished career crossing continents, working with top leaders at some of the world's most famous companies. But that's not why we love him. With the university, he's been really keeping going this wonderful heritage that the Lake District has of critical thinkers and bringing that into contemporary education. He's even been doing that longer than the University of Cumbria, probably for almost 20 years now. But that's not why we love him. So, what I've found working with Richard is, working on papers on critical leadership, is that this past trade union activism, this sense of social justice, has not left him at all. He brings that into his work, he wears it on his sleeve, and it's always there in our thinking and in our writing. But that's not why I love him. So when I moved to the Lake District, he got me out on the fells, but he also introduced me to a range of sort of intellectual icons and creatives in the Lake District. And it really, over time, helped me see that there's something about this beautiful landscape which, when you think about it, all the different people who've sort of done amazing work here, they could have lived in cities, they could have been far easier to get audiences and get venues and get resources, but they chose to be in a beautiful landscape and with other people who choose to be in a beautiful landscape, to have time for contemplation and conversation and look for those sort of timeless truths rather than just keeping up with whatever is the latest urban fad. And Richard is instinctively loyal to that tradition, which makes him a wonderful ambassador for what we're trying to do at the university. So that's not why I love him. But I'm going to leave it with you to discover that for yourselves. And so let's give a round of applause to our new visiting professor of sustainability leadership, Richard Little.
I'm still waiting to find out why you love me. Thanks, Jem. And yeah, I thought you were going rather well. You could have the whole of the hour if you like. More reasons. Yeah, before I start, I should also... Oh, Graham, hello. I should also thank Howard and all the people at Brantwood, Helen, who did the poster and everything. And it's a particular privilege for me to work here. It always has been. I've always loved Brantwood. And, of course, Ruskin. This is Ruskin, by the way, lest you were wondering. Am I audible at the back, by the way? Am I audible at the front? Good, okay, good, that's fine. Covered all our bases. I hope to stay audible. I have a chronic voice problem, but I've got lots of water. If at any point I become inaudible, can somebody rush downstairs and get more of it? And I should be all right. So, what else do I need to say by way of preliminaries? Any ideas? Oh, well, there's an obvious thing to say here. Oh, hi, Katie. Which is that I had a 60th birthday party about quite a long time ago, actually. And we put a marquee on the back lawn. And Kate, I think you came. Did you do Kate and Chris? Did you? And the next day, when everybody had gone home, loads and loads of people turned up. Because I'd accidentally invited them for the following day. I'd invited some people for Thursday the 9th and some people for Friday the 8th or whatever it was. And it was a disaster because I wasn't ready for the second lot. But in an odd sort of way, this is rather like having my 60th birthday party again, because an awful lot of you are really good friends who it's wonderful to see and wonderful to torture for an hour. So thank you, friends and colleagues, for coming, and thank you everybody else, people who aren't yet friends, for coming. I just hope that you don't resent the time that I keep you from the barbecue, because I'm all that stands between you and the barbecue. And I mean to stand here for quite a while. Sorry. Let me just go back to the beginning. We had a problem with the laptop, and I've got this thing that tells me what to say in enormous letters. On this new laptop, it's gone down to tiny, tiny little letters, so I have no idea what I'm talking about. I'm just going to have to guess and hope for the best. Like my branding, Paul, where are you? Showing the flag. It was that, or the hammer and sickle. Oh, by the way, thank you for mentioning trade unionism. I forget I was a convener for a union which had a K in its title, and the K stood for Kinney employees. That's how long ago it was. Perhaps you don't even know what Kinney is. They renamed it Cinema, but it was still Kinney then. The National Association of Television, Theatre and Kinney Employees. It's a very unpopular union, and I was a very unpopular person. But that encouraged me. I thoroughly enjoyed being unpopular, always have. And I went on to work as an officer for the TUC for 3 years, while doing other things. And you're quite right, I did learn an awful lot doing that I might not otherwise have learned about the realities of the workplace. And I learned a lot more working for Impact. And several of my colleagues from Impact are here as well. Impact is a consulting company. We work all over the world. We say that we develop leadership and organizational capacity and develop organizations. What we really do is not always exactly that. I don't want to go into it now. But one thing that has given me is an extraordinary perspective, a cross-section, a view of organizations. I mean, I've lost count of the number of different organizations that I've become intimate with, sometimes working for them for years. I mean, with my colleague Simon, we worked with PT for the best part of 15 or 16 years. I worked for Goldman Sachs for 5 years, SHL for 5 years. When you spend 5 years working as a consultant in a company, and in the NHS as well, which is by far the most challenging and interesting work, which was in effect pro bono, although we didn't know at the time. The thing that you realize is that there are two quite separate things. There's the rhetoric of, let's just talk about business organizations, and especially the very largest. There's a rhetoric of organization. There's a way of expressing. Organizations themselves are given a voice, and we'll see some little examples of the organizational voice, the corporate voice, this evening. And they are subject to the rigors of all kinds of intervention along the lines of management science and consulting and all sorts of things. But actually, 99% of the time, and I'm looking at you, Sam, because I hope you're going to confirm this, 99% of the time, it's people who are perfectly decent people, managers, executives, even chief executives. There are some decent ones. In fact, I never met one that wasn't. Trying to do the best they can to solve problems, mostly involving intractable people, which is one of the secrets of the trade. And also, there is another secret, and if you remind me, I can tell you later during the barbecue. There's only one question you ever need to ask as an organization development consultant. Just one question, and it's the $1 million question, literally. It's I might forget it later, but never mind. Beg your pardon?
We're not going to concentrate now, you see.
You'll be trying to guess what the question is. Well, there we are. It's worked. That's how it works. Where was I? Yeah, anyway, you get this. You see all these organizations, and you get to compare organizations, which is very different from being in one or belonging to one. And some of them were universities. I spent 11 years working with the University of Edinburgh on research leadership. It was horrific. It gave me it made me very glad that I wasn't. I was going to say. Yeah. Well, anyway, never mind. Moving on. I get these blank moments nowadays. Moving on. So you get a wonderful comparative view of organisations, and I just ask you to take my word for it that you learn a lot through comparison. And I have one comparison which is like a benchmark for me. That's my own organisation, Impact, and it was always telling to think, would this happen in my organisation? Would this happen in Impact? Or how would it be? You know, I'd worked with consulting companies like SHL, former Savile and Holdsworth, and in many ways they're very like Impact, but they weren't. And by the time I left it, it was a frighteningly cutthroat place in which constructive dismissal was an everyday event, and it was working exclusively for to produce better returns for shareholders. Nothing else entered the heads of its owners and executives from one day to the next. And I could compare it with Impact. And what I learned was that Impact was an absolutely unique and extraordinary organisation. And one of the reasons it is that its owner and its sole owner and manager, Dave Williams, genuinely has no interest in profit unless it's linked to actual educational and social goods. Simply no interest at all. Profit is a means to an end. And that's exactly what, well, I imagine that it might be something that, where's he gone? Oh, well, you know, Ruskin might have admired or agreed with. I mean, if one could put the philosophy of unto this last in its simplest form, it's that the people should not be sacrificed for profit. Commerce, trade, industry, business is there to provide a service, to provide goods, social goods, full stop. And if it makes a profit, so much the better. But that profit is not, strictly speaking, I mean, you know, we rely on a very slightly crazy mechanism for redistributing that profit under the current settlement. I'm going to come on to a little bit of that, but I'm thinking of starting. So I'm kind of working myself up to starting. Right. What I'm going to do is look at a particular topic through a series of different lenses or perspectives. And the topic is the broad question of whether technology, or let's start with capital, whether capital, with technology driving it, is too much for our existing social institutions, our civil society institutions, too much for democracy. Whether it doesn't actually consist of it doesn't actually mount to a direct challenge, a direct threat to democracy. I'm using democracy in the broadest possible sense, not just representative democracies, but the broad, those polities and committees which consist of people, broadly speaking, finding the means to agree with one another. I rely very heavily, as my colleagues know, on Jürgen Habermas and his ideas of the public sphere to help me define what I mean by that. So again, that's going to be imminent, at least, in what I've got to say. I'd go a little bit further and say that the combination of technology and capitalism automatically and naturally encroaches on every kind of civil society institution. It just does it naturally, can't help it. And I'm going to mention briefly as we go along Daniel Bell, the very right-ish American sociologist, who gives us a particularly good way of looking at this briefly. So the first thing I'm going to do with this idea is look at some texts. These texts are taken almost but not quite at random from the literature of human resource management and organizational consulting. I picked them by opening a book at random or a magazine and sticking my finger in. Literally, there is no cherry picking. And I ended up with a couple of texts for tonight and a couple of old ones, which I've used before. And I mean to look at them in a particular way. And then to move on to a little bit of history about scientific management and how it evolved, and then a little bit of theory to help us interpret that, or to give us a perspective on that. And then finally, to actually do what I said in the title, which is look at workplace surveillance as one manifestation or effulgence of this collision between technology and the institutions of democracy. It's too small. I'm just going to have to think. It's not going to be easy, but we'll do our best. So let me just, I'll show you the text in a moment. We've got an epigraph to go through before we get to the text. But when looking at a text closely, it's my contention, well, there's lots of people's contention, that even in trivial texts, even in signs in Virgin Trains lavatories or Christmas card doggerel, everywhere you can find traces of larger social formations, of larger social orders. Think of it as like a seismographic trace of a volcano going off somewhere. Tiny, tiny little indications, in themselves pointless and trivial. It is what they point to that's important. And what they point to is always debatable, is always arguable. So the kind of analysis that I intend to go through, and if possible, ask for your help with these texts, I keep pointing at the text and it isn't there, it will be eventually, is not formal, is not, I mean, what are our options? We've got critical discourse analysis, the one that springs most readily to my mind, because that's the one that I know best. Norman Fairclough from Lancaster gave us this extraordinarily penetrating way of dismantling the power relations implicit in text. We could look at it hermeneutically with the help of Gadama. I'm not going to do that. We'd all go to sleep long before we'd finished. We could look at it, I mean, you use all kinds of things as you construct grammatical trees, you do a lexical analysis or syntactical, you could unpick text in a million different ways. And there's one way which is very English and very traditional, and that's the tradition of close reading. I.A. Richard, Empson, Leavis, of simply responding to the text. And of course they bring interpretive strategies and devices and tools to it, but it starts with the idea that one can simply understand a text by reading it, which Hans-Jörg Gadamer wouldn't agree with. So we'll look at the text in a moment, but first my epigraph, and it's Ruskin. This is the book, Unto This Last. I'm very proud of this particular copy. Green leather, you can't feel it, but it feels lovely. And let me just put this, in the document that I left on your chair, there's the full text of the surrounding paragraphs of this. Ruskin is taking political economy to task. Now, please talk to me later, Howard. Or discreetly look the other way and whistle. After careful study of Unto This Last and other texts on political economy by Ruskin, I think he had a slight tendency to the polemical and isn't always fair to the texts that he's critiquing, particularly to Adam Smith, who, for me, actually was saying an awful lot of the things that Ruskin perhaps understood this, but it was a polemic. And righteous anger has a place in public argument. And Ruskin says political economy is it's a theory, And it rather resembles a theory which says that if we had gymnasts, it'd be an awful lot easier if they didn't have skeletons, because they could be rolled up into little balls, they could be stretched thin, they could get through special places, they could flip and do all kinds of things. There's only one thing wrong with that theory, and that is that it lacks, in his word, applicability. And that in turn reminds me of Yogi Berra, who for years I got mixed up with Yogi Bear, but apparently he's a real person. He was a baseball fan, and he said the immortal line. In theory and practice are the same. In practice, they're not. And he's kind of right. I mean, he probably hadn't read Marx or Lukács, but there's a lot in that, and that's what Ruskin's saying. It's a good theory, but it won't work. And so is political science, but political economy, does it the other way around. Rather than taking out the skeleton, it strips the flesh. It regards people as only skeleton. And I believe that idea is structurally, conceptually homologous with the idea of stripping people of their humanity and regarding them as fungible, regarding them as objects simply of capital, people who exist solely to work on somebody else's behalf. And Ruskin goes on to theorize about the relationship between the poor and the wealthy as a kind of zero-sum game. So that's my epigraph. And I mean to look at the idea of people stripped of their flesh, their affections, their rights, their talents, because as one strand in industrial science doesn't want people to be skilled at all. Excuse me. Oh, wrong glass. Move on. During the 1920s and 30s, this became an international obsession. I'm going to look very briefly at Frederick W. Taylor and Winslow Taylor and scientific management as we go along. It's something most people are familiar with, but I want to include it because it's a crucial point in this story. Oh, it's not a story. It's not a story. It's because it doesn't really have a beginning. I mean, I was trying to find the beginning of this, and I was reminded of Wittgenstein's point in On Certainty when he says, what does he say? It might be on one of the, yes. It's so difficult to find the beginning, or better, it's difficult to begin at the beginning and not to try to go further back. And that's my experience with everything I ever do. You think you've thought of something, and then you discover that you have to think something else in order to get there. You have to go back, endlessly backwards, and you never reach the end. It's an infinite regression of explanation. Carnap, and so very good on that. But it became an obsession. This is I rather like this because it's a little bit like the stripping of the flesh or the removal of the skeletons. And there was rather a scare in the 1920s and 30s about whether people were being reduced to the status of robots. This is Jean-François Lyotard. I like to be able to see the people we're talking about. I think it's important that we remember that they're people, flesh and bone, and it's good to know their biographies as well. And before engaging with their thought, or perhaps after engaging their thought, that's more like it, isn't it? And this is my coup, and I hope that you're all very excited about it because I've made a major discovery. Only a very few people know about this already, and it's about Lyotard. And it's that we're all keen to know where he was in between publications. There was some quite long gaps, as you'll remember, before the postmodern condition, for instance, and I found out where he was. He was moonlighting as Alan Rickman. And you may have noticed that Alan Rickman wasn't always around. I once saw him in Liberty in London. He was really quite short. I checked. He's exactly the same height as Leotard, 5'9½". So there we are. But Leotard is important because his most famous line, I think, is post-modernity is distrust of meta-narrative. Now, I would say post-modernity is a meta-narrative. So get over it. What critical philosophy should do is distrust all narrative. Life doesn't have, well, life does have a beginning, a middle, and end. Life does, but reality doesn't. It's dangerous to narrativize events. It's a useful tool, as long as you remember that's all it is, and you dismantle your narrative before moving on. And it's very tempting to narrativize the history of work and the history of industry and technology. I'm going to try to avoid that, but I might not always. So I've got a text which we've already seen. I've also got an image, and this is my image. Does anybody recognize it? It's a lump of wood, by the way, with a ring on top. No?
Robert Owen. Is it Robert Owen's? Was it Robert Owen?
Yes!
Employees?
Yes, it was.
Yes, because for what they did, yes. But
It's the silent monitor.
Got away with it.
That's it, yes. It was spun round every evening, or not if you're lucky. As him, Robert Owen. I love that. It's wonderful to see very early photographs of people who were just on the cusp of photography. There he is. And this is a cardboard cutout model of the wooden block that you can buy in the shop at New Lanark, which is Robert Owen's mill. Clearly the originals were made of wood and the colours faded. The silent monitor was hung in a little three-sided box in front of each workplace. And every evening, the supervisor would turn it around. If white was facing outwards, the conduct of the employee had been excellent. If black was facing outwards, well, I'm sure you can guess what the black was quite rare. Blue and yellow are intermediate positions between excellence and vicious wickedness. The results were recorded as little coloured dots in a ledger, and other data was kept as well. Now, Owen is, of course, famous as being the most emancipatory, the most liberal-minded in the broad sense, mill owner. In fact, he went into mill owning explicitly to do that, to create a mill which was humane, which educated its workers, which treated them in every possible way differently from the norm in mills. Remember, at that time it was routine in the mills of Yorkshire for children who fell asleep at the loom to be held upside down in a bucket of water until they fainted. That was the accepted remedy for falling asleep at your post, which I think is probably not a bad idea. I wish somebody would do it to me occasionally, but corporal punishment was normal. In fact, corporal punishment was used at New Lanark. And people are like, it's messy. These things are messy. The history is messy. It wasn't perfect because he tried to set up, what was it, New Harmony. This is New Harmony in Indiana, and you were saying something about the currency there, which was going to be a sort of perfect mill in America. It didn't work out. And the silent monitor is, in the same way that Ruskin's text represents something analogous with workplace surveillance, which I'm coming to, so is this, clearly. This is a first attempt at some sort of developmental effort in the workplace. His intention was developmental. It wasn't primarily to punish. The silent monitor is still in use, and we're going to come to that. In use on an enormous scale. Enormous. But it's been mechanized, of course. Right, here's my first text. As advertised in the title, let them have fun. There's absolutely no question of us doing that this evening. This is from People Management, which is the journal of the magazine of the CIPD, the main HR thing in the UK. And it's just a perfectly ordinary bit of jobbing journalism by somebody called Fiona McKay, who specialises in this kind of stuff. I nearly said something like that. This kind of stuff. It's section 6 of a longer article about team building. And what I'd like to do is look closely at this for a few minutes. But before I do, I could just launch into it and drone on for hours. I'd rather like to just collect a few impressions from you about this text, particularly the title. Oh, and by the way, there's no evidence of irony in the way that it's positioned in the rest of the text. None at all. I wish there was. Does anything what do you notice about it? How do you? What impression do you have of this thing? Ken.
There's an us and them.
There's an us and them. Who's the us?
And the us are the really powerful managers. Yeah.
The us are managers.
Yeah.
So how do you divine that from the text? Where are the managers?
Talking about the people as things that you can manipulate or deal with or
Deal with it.
yeah.
You let them do things.
You let them.
You give them permission.
You're allowed.
You have it in your power to give them permission to do things. Yes, so absolutely. So there's an implied managerial class who are being invited to let them have fun by an author. So that's straight to the heart of the matter, Ken. What else do you notice about it?
Separation from work and elsewhere in work time.
Yes, absolutely. Work time.
If you only spend time and effort building and maintaining the team in work time, there's a separation.
Yeah, like a fun time and work time. In fact, as we might get a chance to see, there are some glaring and very weird direct contradictions in this about what work is. Grace.
This implies that most of the work is not fun. Everything you do is
Absolutely.
not fun.
Yes. So there's a world of implication here.
Yeah.
It's not fun, but it implies that people are not inclined to let them have fun. These people who have power, Ken's managerial class, and it might imply that them are all bloody desperate to have fun, and that all they're interested in is having fun, and some of the sort of, or it might not. It's not absolutely clear. What else?
The emphasis on building a team rather than building relationships.
A team.
So rather than being the other way around. The relationships are not coming first in the text.
Strengthening the vital relationships in the team. So a team is something that contains vital relationships here. But just pursue that idea a little bit further. What's wrong with that?
That's the bottom line is the only place that the word relationship is mentioned.
Yeah.
Whereas everywhere else it's team building.
Yes.
Whereas relationships the core.
Right. We might also say that the team doesn't just not have relationships in it. It doesn't have anything in it. It's an empty signifier. Let me come on to that. Could we hold that thought and we'll just work a little bit through a little bit before we get to that, because there's some distinctions between different kinds of turning things into other things going on here, and teams is a glaring one. I'll come to that in a moment. So thanks, Georgia. One more before we move on? Yes, Joe.
There are no people. There are no people.
No people. Enlarge a little on that.
Well, as Georgia was saying, there are blocks, there are
Right.
objects.
Yeah. There are thems, there are teams. Down here there's a little bit of a concession to the fact that people might actually have wants, needs, be real, have relationships. Absolutely. Good. So actually, you've done 99% of the work. I've got nothing to add to that, but I'm going to anyway. First of all, let's go to Ken's point. There's a them, and they are the. There are different levels of analysis, but I mean, them have fun, kind of verbal phrase, but the main burden of the sentence is letting them have fun. Somebody is letting them have fun. Them are kind of people you can do things to, as Ken pointed. And let is the key difficulty in this whole text. An awful lot hinges on it. The grammatical mood of the sentence varies according to what you think is meant by let. There's a very obvious thing going on here, which is it's supposed to be a little bit, possibly not in the mind of the person who wrote it, but somewhere along the line there's let them eat cake, which is a different let, an entirely different let. So the preliminary to let them eat cake would be, if they don't have bread, then why don't they eat cake? So the let isn't permissive. It's jussive, to use the mood. This is very close to being cohortative. In another world, it might have been, let's have fun. Let's all get together and have fun. But it isn't. It takes this particular variety of subjunctive with that tiny little echo of the apocryphal story about Marie Antoinette in the background. And this is, I'm taking a liberty here, of putting in the, as it were, pretext, one possible set of as it were, surrounding texts. There's an author, there's clearly an author, and the author must of necessity be an expert on team building, otherwise why would she be writing it? Unless she's in cahoots with the editor and publisher, which is far more likely to be the case. We've got an editor and publisher who other entities are implied in this text, who are present in its production. But the author, an expert on it, suggests that you and the implied reader, the ideal implied reader, is somebody who does teamwork, who builds teams. Now, that's not me, but I'm reading it. So there's something funny about the implied reader. You're all reading it, and perhaps some of you are going to go off tomorrow and build a team. But somehow I doubt it. You've got more sense than that. So there's an implied ideal author, and also there's an implied reluctance. Let them have fun. Go on, let them have fun. Why on earth don't you let them have fun? Idiotic not to let. Oh, poor things. You're just driving them to an early death. You should give them a day off. Let them go for a runabout in a field. Poor things. Let the cows out for summer. It's cruel what you're doing. This is very common. Let them have a bit of fun. It's more grudging. I'll be perfectly frank. When I put let them have fun and variations into DuckDuckGo, I got bloody millions of them. And it was more than a life's work to go through them. But I like this one. Creativity can happen anywhere. If you don't have the freedom to joke around or even have minor fun, we've got some other kinds of fun coming up. There's some really weird people out there. They won't have those happy accidents. And here, in this one, there's naked instrumentalization of fun. Fun is there to make people more creative. It's an obsession with business to make people creative. I don't know why they bother, because they don't take any notice of them when they are creative. I mean, the last thing business wants is people going off on one, being creative and having visions. But that's what they talk about all the time. You know, oh God, I'm sorry, I've had a vision. I've had a vision of the future. Get back to your bloody laptop. So anyway, that's freedom to joke around. They should have the freedom to joke around. The most obvious thing about this for me is something that struck me in about 1972. My first job at Leeds Playhouse. I was rather acutely aware, having been, I forgot to mention the National Union of School Students, that's the reason I was expelled. I was rather acutely aware of my democratic rights and responsibilities. And to enter a workplace where everybody told me what to do was a bit of a shock. And I was absolutely the bottom of the pile. And when I became NatKey convener, everybody took great delight in kicking me and making me do the most dangerous jobs without any kind of safety. 8 o'clock, God. Right, we're going to have to move on. Okay, there's something else going on here. I've jumped to Martha Nussbaum, the American social philosopher and inventor of the capability approach to international development, a wonderful author. And she gives us something very useful, which is a checklist of ways to objectify people. Remember them, they're the object of the sentence, and they are not allowed subjectivity. They're just them. We let them do things. They don't do things autonomously. They're assumed to be infantile, supine. And the word often used for that is reified. They're reified. I personally think that that's a wholly inadequate word for the job. Hands up if you've ever been confused by the word reified. Well, good. I think it's an intrinsically confusing concept. Turning people into things. Well, they're already things. Turning them into merely things. What exactly does that mean? Well, Nussbaum gives us a clue. Any one of these constitutes objectification for Nussbaum. And with them, I would argue that we've got at least 3, possibly 4. They're assumed as lacking moral autonomy. For Nussbaum, for Charles Taylor, and for me, autonomy is not freedom. Autonomy is not freedom of action. It's the freedom to determine the causes or reasons for action. That is, say, to develop a moral consciousness. Whether you get a chance to exercise it is another matter, but you can have it, and you have autonomy regardless of circumstances. That is to say, your freedom of action might be constrained, but you're still free to determine your attitude to that freedom or lack of freedom. That's my theory anyway. Treating the person as inert and lacking agency. Let them have fun. Well, why don't they just decide to have fun for themselves? Not allowed. Sorry. Treating the person as a fungible. Can they be substituted? That's the whole history of scientific industrialism, is turning people into substitutable people with exchangeable skills. There was another one, wasn't there? Sorry. Lacking in boundary and integrity, are they violable? I won't go into that because that takes us into another possibility, another possible form of objectification, which is a little bit more complicated. I think I'm sort of overshot slightly in the complexity of this reading. There's something else going on here. Georgia, you were there, and that is that teams is used in a particular way. That gives us another way of objectifying something, or another way of ontologically confusing something. Teams are built and maintained, they materialize. That is to say, there's a thing called a team. Now, as Joe pointed out, and is implicit in what you were saying, Georgia, teams are people. And the people aren't a team. The team is just one way we can describe them in certain circumstances, taking certain liberties. And the word that we use for that is hypostatization. That is to say, we're mistaking an abstract thing for a tangible thing, for a concrete thing, the fallacy of misplaced concreteness. Again, far better than reification as a word to describe this process. Reification gets you absolutely nowhere. I'm speaking from hard, bitter experience of reading Lukács and Marx and trying to figure out what the hell they mean by reification. Well, Marx doesn't use the word. And finally, in this text, I want to draw your attention to something going on which is actually very complicated and goes on a lot. And that's what I call a rebound. It should be okay for teams to go on, but the mood is changing. Of course, that's not an excuse for not working. but the occasional purely social or fun time is okay. There's something, there's a rebound, there's a ricochet in this text between letting them have fun, making them work. Oh no, letting them have fun. This pattern, this oscillation is the particular point which I believe is significant in this text. So I've got another example of it here. This is, I love this one. Barbara Hayne McMahon, she also writes an awful lot about organizations. She goes on after this to instruct exactly in how to give a hug. I had it in my mind that we would practice tonight, but it's going to take too long. One of the things she recommends is, first of all, she explains that for a man, you should put both arms at the same level, not one under the arm and one above the arm. And you should let go when the other person lets go. To women, she says, you must put the arm a little bit lower, presumably because women are supposed to be smaller. I don't know. And you should let go at the same time that the man lets go. And it's really interesting trying to actually follow those instructions. She, in another work, which I wish I had with me, she says, hugging is great, but actually you should, far better than hugging, take people firmly just above the elbow and squeeze. Does that feel better?
so good.
Good. There we are. So hugging has been managerialized. But do you notice the rebound here, the ricochet? Oh, it's here. Physical contact does, however, carry certain risks. It's really dangerous hugging people. You never know what they might have. Because of the risk of misinterpretation. However, or is it, what is it? Nevertheless, there are times when you can trust your instincts. I mean, she could go on like this all night. Do it. No, no. Oh, go on. No. Wait, it's dangerous. And this is the authentic oscillation between scientific management and emancipatory theories of organization. And it runs through the entire history of managerialism, theorizing about managerialism. And I'm going to cut everything very, very short by rushing, giving you glimpses of wonderful slides you wish I was going to linger on, but I'm not going to. I'm rushing to. Oh, yes, that's. I took your advice and cut all that lot out. Yes, good. So this is pig iron, and this is the Bethlehem Steelworks in somewhere near Chicago, I think. And this was the very pig iron that formed the subject of the most famous book ever written about management, Scientific Management by F.W. Taylor. Lest you think that scientific management has got anything at all to do with science as you know it, I'll just briefly tell you the method for assessing how quickly and how people can move pig iron. First of all, you pick a number or a weight of pig iron to be moved in a day. In this case, 47 tons. Then you pick somebody really keen and really strong and frankly a bit thick, called Schmidt, not his real name, who's a Dutch Protestant. And you do that because you believe that Catholics are incapable of hard work. It's all in the book. Then you force Schmidt to move 47 tons in a day, and then you record that as the maximum amount, the optimum amount, sorry, that people can move in a day. Perfect proof. It's a wonderful experiment. I mean, what could be more elegant? In the meanwhile, rebound. In 1914, the American government was sufficiently alarmed by scientific management to hold congressional hearings. And this is some of the evidence that was presented. I particularly love this thing. So congressional hearings trying to decide whether scientific management is a good idea or a bad idea. One would assume that they decided it was a good idea, but actually they didn't. They decided that it was thoroughly un-American, and they banned it in all state-run industries. completely. And then they hired somebody else to do something very similar, which I'm coming to in a moment, Lillian Gilbreth. But it is slightly reassuring that at least at one point in American history they thought this was egregious, and they did actually try to stop it. Meanwhile, in Russia, if you remember, there was a chap called Stakhanov who shoveled 270 tons of coal in a single shift. He became famous, and his team decided to improve that, and by the end of that year they were moving 3,000 tons a day, and it kept going up. And this, of course, is absolute nonsense. I mean, no human being on earth could move that much coal, but the Soviets were keen to beat the Americans, and Stakhanovite practice was spread right across. Poor old Stakhanov ended up in a flat opposite Berier's headquarters, which must have made him very nervous, because under Stalin, you know, most famous people didn't last very long. But Stakhanovite practice spread all over the Soviet Union. This is a wonderful painting, a Soviet painting of the Stakhanovite going to the factory to encourage people to be more productive. But it's also, so it's a little thing that we didn't go into in that let them have fun thing, and that's the idea of gaze, which is implicit. It's a text, there's nobody looking at anything. But there's a strand in, a theoretical strand that goes back to Laura Mulvey in her famous work on the male gaze, which holds that the managerial gaze is masculine. In fact, you could argue that the subject of the sentence is masculinized if you follow the Irigaray, Judith Butler, and others. So I'm not going to argue the point, but just raise the possibility that managerialism is implicitly a masculine practice in the strict sense. But what's going on here? There's only one woman in the picture, and she's the only person whose eyes we can't see. She's the only person getting on with any work. And she's being regarded with disdain by the chap on the right, the commissar. Each of these people has an identity, and you can work it out from the internal evidence of the picture itself. There's the enthusiastic Stakhanovite. This man, probably from the KGB, with a revolver in his pocket, about to shoot somebody. It's all happening. It's scientific management in the. At the same time, I throw Mary Parker Follett in without elaboration because she towers above every other consultant at Harvard Business School, and we're talking about a Harvard Business School thing here. This is all about Harvard Business School. Taylor, the Gilbreths, Dill Scott, they're all from Harvard Business School. So is Mary Parker Follett. Her formulation was very simple, that scientific management was an abomination, that the only humane form of industrial practice was, as she put it, power with rather than power over, and the power with could only be assumed by people who had rough parity in political power. So she was an ardent believer in trade unions. She believed that workers had to have an independent voice that was nothing whatsoever to do with capital or management. And she was buried completely. It wasn't until the 1980s, I think, that she was revived. She died in 1933, I think. She's a wonderful writer. I warmly recommend her. Lillian Gilbreth, meanwhile, had invented this. This is an attempt to be a little bit more scientific than Taylor. You strap lights to people and then film them. And they at least could show the Gilbreths. She worked with her husband. He was a bit useless. They at least proved that their method worked. For instance, they got the dismantling and reconstruction of a rifle down from 14 minutes to 2 minutes by following people with little lights. God knows what happened to the poor sods who actually had the lights attached to them. I expect a few were electrocuted in the process, but, you know, never mind. I like this one because there's something going on. Something weird going on. I think there's, you know, some sort of weird spooky thing coming out of his head. Ectoplasm. Hawthorne studies, very briefly, a series of studies at an enormous factory that lasted 7 or 8 years. You, first of all, experiment with lighting. Dim the lights. Does productivity go up or down. Raise the lights, does productivity, keep the lights the same, control group. And what they discovered was it didn't matter what you did, productivity went up. Their conclusion was the attention and certain permissions given to people in the study encouraged them, and what Elton Mayo and Roethlisberger discovered was that even employees in factories had social affections and actually liked being with certain people rather than other people, had feelings, had ambitions and stuff like that. Astonishing. Almost immediately, the findings of the Hawthorne studies, which are still disputed to this day, were instrumentalized. They were turned into a science of motivation. People started doing elaborate calculations to work out how exactly to get people to feel good in the workplace. And that effort goes on to this day. I hope that the oscillation is kind of apparent in this, the switching from the instrumental to the emancipatory and back again. Everything anybody has ever done to try to introduce something genuinely emancipatory in the workplace has been borrowed by somebody else and turned into a means of oppression. And I'd hope that I can just justify that. This is, I'm definitely running out of time, so extremely briefly, and discounting all the other theoretical resources we have, I'm just going to talk briefly about what Weber says about this and offer an early 20th century borderline postmodern language turn perspective on what's going on. Weber was, amongst other things, strongly influenced by Ferdinand Tönnies, who, as you see, is a cross between a German philosopher and a border terrier. And Tönnies is famous. Is it Tönnies? Tönnies. I love the way you say it. Tönnies. Tönnies is famous for one duality, the Gemeinschaft and Gesellschaft. He believed that there were ideal types of social order which had followed one another in succession. The first was the pre-modern form of feudal and other sorts of agrarian social orders in which power was largely based on traditional relationships, kinship, kingship, and so on, and you know, it was kind of life as the typical villager in Germany would know it in about 1550. Because Ferdinand Braudel came along and showed that they were insanely capitalistic and doing futures trading while all this was going on. But you know, we can safely ignore that for the time being. So, ideal types of human association. The Gesellschaft was the response of society to technology. It was a contractualization of relationships. It was a society based on rules, on sanctions, on the law, and on division of labor. And it was better adapted to industrial realities than Gemeinschaft. Weber took that idea and asked what the underlying reasons were for social order. And he characterized one as what he called value rationality, the Gemeinschaft, as where people's actions are justified or explained by an appeal to what was right or wrong or good or bad or valued. Whereas Gesellschaft, he called Zweckrationalität, was something in which decisions, power, were all organized according to rational, legal power. That's what he's famous for. And finally, I'm going to I've jumped over a lot of detail. Daniel Bell. I just will offer one thing from Daniel Bell and then move on. He's despite his awful reputation, he's a wonderful writer and thinker. He's been a favorite of mine for decades. And he wrote about the post-industrial future. And one detail of his view of of how society is organized is that technology is always driving social institutions harder than they can adapt. Always. And all social forms are responses to technology since the Industrial Revolution. And they never catch up. And I would ask you to just think about whether we are in the middle of one of the recurring crises of trying to catch up with technology, where social institutions, the law and democracy are hopelessly maladapted to cope with the torrent of dreadful things that technology promises. And remember Foucault's point in Interview, all technology will be used against us. Is it? Mary Midgley, just thrown her in. She's one of our favourites. Moving on, Habermas, we'll skip Habermas. Horkheimer. Horkheimer and Adorno, just one quote from Horkheimer. The fully enlightened earth radiates disaster triumphant, the opening line of the dialectic of enlightenment. And that absolutely sums up this oscillation that I've been trying to illustrate. You can see it as an oscillation between Gemeinschaft and Gesellschaft, between a society based on love and a society based on exploitation and rules, a juridified society, as Habermas would call it. Or you can see it as the battle between instrumental reason. The Enlightenment gave us reason and abolished superstition. Didn't work, but that was the plan. But it accidentally split reason into the instrumental kind, which exploits, and the emancipatory kind, which frees. That was their point. So back to the thing. Now I've come to the last part of this, and I just want to make sure that you can last it out. If I promise to be finished in 10 minutes, are you okay with? I mean, the barbecue will. I'm pretty sure it'll still be there, won't it? It will. Yeah. Okay. You're all right with that? I don't want to kind of. Nobody's asleep yet, or at least Jeanette. Yeah. No. Nobody's asleep. She's awake. But good. Silent monitor. Silent monitor. It really is called the silent monitor, and it's used in call centres, and it enables. Remember Laura Mulvey in The Male Gaze? Here's an even better example. Whoops! Now I can check out her. What's this? This is absolutely routine. It's operated in. There are thousands of producers of this software. They're all over the place, and every call centre on the planet has them, and there are an awful lot of call centres. Impact worked with a call centre once for Marks and Spencer's, and our recommendation was that they had no management, basically, and let people say what they liked on the phone for as long as they wanted. And they won a prize for best call centre. Incredible. It worked. Do you remember Marks and Spencer's? Had a dreadfully, the most embarrassing moment in my entire career. I can't talk about it. I'm afraid I can't tell you what it is. It's just too embarrassing. It was, just thinking about it makes me, right, I'll move on. This is the new silent monitor, Japanese style. As you leave the workplace, you bang one of those things they have at customs, green, yellow, or red, to say how you're feeling. And here's the refinement, sorry?
Poor Anne. Poor Anne. Anne's not having a good week.
Oh, Anne, yes. Yeah. Oh, she brightens up though. The management got to her. They bribed her. Or maybe they let her have fun. The wonderful refinement, which is, I suspect, apocryphal, is that you were told to do it with your thumb, and they had a fingerprint reader camera inside the button. Sports Direct, the Daily Mail insisted that Sports Direct did this, but I'm not sure that it's true. They didn't deny it. This is the kind of metric you get. You wouldn't believe how much information they can squeeze from those things. Reams of it, all completely and utterly invalid, as is nearly all information derived from workplace surveillance. Now, I'm not going to go into this. This is my beautiful model of different varieties of surveillance, but I'm just going to give you a few snapshots. The first is about the idea of self-quantification. And it turns out to be the case that self-quantification is increasingly a requirement of employers in large corporations. That is to say, you provide them with data about your health, your activity, even your reading and TV watching, and recently, your sleep patterns. There's a, oh, I love this, relentlessly dedicated, measurable self-improvement. They relentlessly self-quantify. I think actually something else is relentless about this, and it's not them. Self-quantifying. I leave you to imagine what this particular app does. It's by no means the worst of its kind. I blush to tell you about some of the others. But this is a bestseller. It's £5.49 to download it. Oh. How would I know? Where are we? Move on. It goes without saying that everybody, well, not everybody, certainly not me, and I hope nobody here, but a lot of people are allowing straightforward surveillance devices into their homes in the shape of little cylinders. You can, of course, get these. These are not bought by parents who want to monitor their children. They're bought by partners who want to monitor their partner. That's their big selling point. And again, I've spared you the worst of these. Smoke detector cameras, love it. I hope the camera doesn't set off the smoke alarm. Back to the workplace, this has become well known since the last time I gave it an outing. This is the Humanize badge. It goes around your neck on a little, lanyard, and it sends real-time data back to management. Has anybody ever used one, or anybody ever come across it? I love the title of the company, Humanize. I mean, at least they have a sense of humour. And what is really wonderful about this is that it sends data back about your interactions with your colleagues in the form of actual recordings of what you said, but also analysis of the words you used, the demeanour, God knows how they know. And they use this to work out what works best, what makes a team more productive, which is a miracle because nobody on this earth has ever been able to work out what makes a team productive. There's a lot of management science that pretends to, but they've found the key link between observed behaviour and what goes on, and it simply doesn't exist. So they're not only snooping on you, they're doing it for no good reason. But this is very popular, and this is only one of a dozen or so similar badges which are now becoming commonplace. I saw somebody in a Costa Coffee wearing one only a couple of months, last time I was in London. So there, spotted it. Move on. Some of you may remember this from the Leadership and Democracy module, Smile Scan. It sounds made up. This is very primitive technology. This is years ago. It's incredibly sophisticated now. I was at the CIPD expedition. What are they called? Exhibition. The one in Manchester a few years ago. And I stood by a stand, and somebody said, "Look." And I looked up, and there was me on a screen. And she said, "Yeah, we got your face." And it broke up my face into little squares and wiggles and things. And then she said, "We're going to track you all the way around the exhibition for the next hour." Yeah. And apparently everybody was really pleased about this and excited about it. And they were going around and then coming back to see themselves and find out all the data about where they'd been and what they'd done and what they'd thought, what they'd had for lunch, whether they'd been to the loo. by the way, I don't know if this is switched on, but when I went to the loo, I was talking to myself earlier, so I hope you erased that. SmileScan is made by Omron. It's a Japanese company. It's in use in a great many shops in particular, where it's trained on people at their things. The blurb goes on to show some of the situations where it's jolly useful. You just weren't smiling warmly enough. It rates smiles on a scale of 100. It gives you a percentage for your smile. And if the warmth of your smile falls below 80%, scientifically determined, well, I'm sorry, but I'm afraid you're going to be fired. There's a company called The White Company on English high streets. They did use this for a while, but then they simply put monitors with regional managers watching people in real time as much as they possibly could. And one of our students, whose name I'm ashamed to say I've forgotten, in the MA in development training before the University of Cumbria existed, did her dissertation on this, on The White Company. And believe me, they really live up to their name. Save a lot of trouble if it's built in. This technology is, you haven't got one, have you, Karen? You didn't have one when you were at Apple? No, good. I don't think they've been invented then, have they? Here's a, what was it, a chip party. It's voluntary. All technology will be used against us. It's voluntary there. It might not be voluntary next time. It's so jolly convenient. You can use it for opening doors. You can use it for paying in vending machines. I mean, how convenient is that? A lot of this, a lot of the social, I mean, I'm not denying that there are social goods, arguable or not, associated with surveillance. Of course there are. I'm not denying that security is something that we might want to have. I just remind you, all technology will be used against us, and is being. Sleep tracking is now routine in some American workplaces, and note the implicit instrumentalization of sleep here. I've got a better example. These are some of the things that happen to, where is it? Types of leadership behavior associated with high quality leadership and the effect of sleep on it. There's something you said, Jem, in your introduction, which was, I'd worked with leaders. And I'm sure you've noticed that everybody in the world is now called a leader. You know, we have horticultural leadership, we have cultural leadership, we have every kind of leadership. American schools and some British schools train children in leadership. I think they're just people. I mean, get over it. Moving on. But if you fall asleep at work, remember the upside down children in the buckets? Doze alert catches people snoozing at work. Do you ever snooze at work, Joe? And of course, it goes without saying, this is absolutely routine, that keystrokes are counted. Every screen you look at in many workplaces is recorded in perpetuity. And absurdly, this particular software adds up the total number of keystrokes and movements on the thing on the grounds that the people who make more are more productive. I know that 90% of mine are me erasing mistakes and kind of trying to find things that I should have. So I think they got that one wrong. And that's the saving grace of this, is that the technology doesn't really work and the data it produces is rubbish. It doesn't mean that they're not trying. They. Hypostatized, objectified entity. Bastards. Meanwhile, just in case you're thinking of rewarding staff, Michael C. Finer will do it for you. You can outsource all your corporate rewards, including deciding what gift to people when they retire, to Michael C. Finer or a dozen other companies. And many corporations do that now. She, by the way, is probably going to press the green button. I'm going to finish with this and a couple of slides, and then we're through. This is a sign you see everywhere. I'm a collector of signs. I really love signs. Our mutual friend Malcolm McIntosh also loved signs, and everywhere he went he'd take photographs of signs. He was a connoisseur of the language of signs. This is a very common sign, and this is the kind of grown-up version. Notice the tone has changed. It's gone from a sort of joke, not a very nice joke, what Norman Fairclough calls the conversationalization of the public space, to a kind of, the smile's got a little bit like a rictus. I wrote to these people and I said, "Dear Security Sign, I'd like to order 50. I'm building a concentration camp with a view to turning it into an extermination camp if sales pick up, if business picks up." And they wrote back, "Thank you, Premier. We would like to supply items requested." He really did. Aisha. I didn't actually call her, but so nice. And finally, smile, you're already on camera. This is like, if you don't smile, we'll shoot you. These tiny modifications are, I am arguing, indications of a broader social process which objectifies us all and oppresses us all and is in danger of becoming a comprehensive global removal of our democratic autonomy. The Metropolitan Police can track crowds with their iPhones. I've seen it in operation when I was at LSE on a course. Doesn't work anymore. Moving on. You've seen all that, but this is one of about a dozen global projects. This is a joint thing between the CIA, Raytheon, and BAE, and it's intended to be full-time monitoring of a city from a stationary zone that can cover a 60 square mile area and can track every movement of every person, not only outside buildings, but by inference inside and behind buildings. Of course, that bit doesn't work very well because so far they can't see through walls, but they have ways of working backwards from the trajectory observed in the future to work out where people have been in between. There are certain algorithms so that you can shoot people if you want to. For instance, squirting, which is running out of a building. In the American lexicon of drone surveillance, squirting is one of the 10 or so important indicators of terrorist activity. The most important is being a male over the age of 18. It's quite a lot of people. Moving on, human zoo. You remember the human zoos? I'm a little, I miss them myself, but they were in several European cities in New York at the turn of the century. James Post, Deputy Chief of Staff, 2014. We can see everything, and now we're arming our eyes. Well, you draw your own conclusions. I'm really nearly there now. I started with a contention, which was that technology combined with capital presents a real and present danger to our liberty, our humanity. You know, it's bent towards enslavement. This is the street outside City Hall going towards the embankment, and it's recommended as a particularly good photograph. Unfortunately, you're not allowed to take photographs there because it belongs to the Kuwaiti company London for London, or London More, which is a Kuwaiti sovereign wealth fund company, and they won't allow photographs to be taken there or on the embankment. They also won't allow you to write in a notebook or to assemble in a group larger than 4. This is a pseudo-public place. What's the phrase? A POP? I forget what the phrase is. But, And there are a great many more of these now. The back of King's Cross is all a private space. This is a colonization of public space by a corporation. And I would argue that it's exactly the same colonization that we saw in scientific management and in our surveillance examples. This is the area where you can't do anything. Of course, it doesn't work in practice. I went out of my way to get caught there. I went with Mario, my friend, and his 2 sons and wife, so we were 5. We all had notebooks and we all took notes and we took lots and lots of photographs and nobody arrested us, which was really, really annoying. But, you know, Homer nodding. For God's sake. There's a colonization of a high street. There's colonization of our food chain. There's colonization. This is much worse than colonization. This is Monsanto's site in Orissa, where they stole an entire mountain. I went there myself in 2009, met the organizers of the opposition, wasn't allowed to take photographs, and had to walk in. It's a bloody long walk. This is my photograph of the organizer of the opposition being arrested. In Bolivia, if you remember, in the year 2000, an American, an American company, momentarily forgotten the name, was given the rights to all water in Bolivia. And the price of water, the cost of water to the average family was 20% of their income. There were riots, there was armed resistance. At the height of this, it was illegal to collect rainwater. Water profiteering by corporates is kind of the next big story. It's absolutely terrifying. And it now 70% of all water supplies are now the site of profiteering by large corporations. Not quite sure what I just said. This lady, Usha Dar, is in the middle of this fight, professor in India who has spent years trying to prove that air is a free public good, because there are corporations who want to privatize it. And they're winning so far. Water isn't a free public good, lest you thought it was. It's divisible, it can be sold, bought and sold and owned, and pretty much all the water in the world is now owned by somebody. Well, need I say more? The act of writing has been stolen by corporates, and you can't go to a library to read them anymore because they're closing them down. This is that's it. I won't go on. The word that seems to me to express most succinctly what's going on is an encroachment by the corporate interest, fortified by technology, into the private sphere, into the free public sphere of debate and discussion. I think Daniel Bell was right that civil institutions can never quite keep up with the pace of technology, and I think that technology itself is partly driven by a way of thinking, a way of living, which is common to an awful lot of people. There are a lot of young people who, according to the evidence, would find none of this alarming. Some 60% of people under 24 welcome workplace monitoring and surveillance. I don't know what possesses them. Is there anybody under 24 here? It's worth a try. Sorry. I won't go on. I was going to round it off nicely with a quote from Ruskin, so I will, if I can find it. Well, I can't. I hope that I've given some, put some flesh on the bones of Ruskin's original statement. The political economy is still trying to turn us into machines. Robots aren't the danger. It's people becoming robots. So that's my talk. Now you are free to have fun.